Obviously, this is especially so given that people would have access to more resources than they did when these networks were popular in the past, and that the state wouldn't be on hand to regulate them out of existence. Here's another thing that's crucial to take into account. A serious anarchist project for dealing with the injustices committed by the state has to include a rectification for state-committed and state-sanctioned wrongdoing. A particularly obvious example here is the problem of land theft. That's the label that Murray Rothbard uses for it in The Ethics of Liberty. The fact is that politically well-connected, privileged elites have stolen land and resources from poor working class and middle class people. Sometimes they've just used force to claim unclaimed land and keep it from being homesteaded by others. And that's led to the enrichment of some, the impoverishment of others, and the creation of a feudal system in a variety of parts of the world. So if you rectify that, you make a huge difference. Similarly, think about the way in which the state has used tax funds to prop up the wealthy and well-connected. Think about defense contractors and other kinds of big businesses that have benefited from the state's largesse. Seems to me that the assets of those organizations ought to be treated as unowned, because effectively they're the product of the state's thuggery, and as the results of criminal conspiracy, we certainly, they shouldn't be treated in such a way that the criminals who got them are rewarded for their role in promoting state violence. So they ought to be homesteadable by people who work there. That changes things dramatically. So returning land to those from whom it's been stolen, allowing the homesteading of state property, these kinds of things will tend to dramatically shift resources away from the wealthy and well-connected and into the hands of others, especially making it possible for unowned land to be homesteaded will give an enormous source of security to otherwise poor, economically vulnerable people. There's a real shift of income to people currently limited in resources as a result of serious rectification of past injustices. One way I think you can tell the difference between a vulgar libertarian and a real anarchist is that the vulgar libertarian is somebody who says, well, we might just as well leave the distribution of wealth as it is, as if somehow that distribution of wealth reflected anything like the operation of voluntary cooperative interaction instead of large-scale violence and theft. If you recognize that the current distribution of resources reflects that, then it becomes obvious that some sort of rectification is necessary. And it's important to distinguish this from the kind of redistribution that is often proposed by statists on the left, statist Marxists, for instance, for whom the problem is not this or that act of theft, but rather just the undesirable ways in which the market itself is supposed to operate. And so for them, all we have to do is look at the outcome, see that the outcome is undesirable, and make some sort of redistribution happen. For a market anarchist, by contrast, it's really important to look at the history of how we got to where we are, and to look at specific acts of injustice, to identify victims of that injustice, and seek to remedy the injustice in concrete ways. Now, it's also obviously important to recognize that structural changes would make poverty less likely in a stateless society. For instance, rules that made it harder for absentee landlords to sit on undeveloped, uncultivated land would open up this land for homesteading with people by limited resources, and so provide them with an avenue to greater economic security. Now, there are clear disagreements among market anarchists about just how this ought to work, from the folks who think that there ought to be an occupancy and use standard such that if the landlord isn't actually living on the property, the landlord can't maintain title to the property, and whoever is living there automatically can homestead it. All the way to folks who just want to say that long-term abandonment by landlords is the problem. So that's something that I think would mark out differences among different communities in a stateless society, but certainly tougher abandonment rules would make things easier for people who wanted to homestead, and would certainly provide an avenue to increased economic security. Similarly, eliminating props for hierarchical corporations would increase the likelihood that people can enjoy the job security associated with working for themselves, with less risk than a company's being an independent contractor now in a less healthy economy. And this matters obviously because I think most people would prefer to work for themselves or in partnerships or cooperatives rather than in hierarchical corporations, and that's just a quality of life issue. It's also an economic security issue. Obviously, in a big organization, there are some risks that the organization bears, but the organization also has the ability quite arbitrarily very often to get rid of you. But also, if you remove those props for hierarchical organizations, and if you increase people's general level of economic security, and this has been a general theme in Kevin Carson's work of late, people could bargain successfully for better compensation. I mean, in a situation in which there is a buyer's market for labor, people who are stuck in a situation in which they have to work for others find themselves very often having to accept less than ideal terms. The creation of that buyer's market for labor is very often a product of the way in which the state intervenes on behalf of the wealthy and well-connected, on the one hand, and the way in which, on the other hand, it makes it tough to live comfortably and securely with limited resources. If, on the other hand, it were easier to live well with less, and if the wealthy and well-connected and the big businesses that they operate had less power, it would certainly be the case that the ability to bargain on the market for good terms for somebody seeking to work for others would be different. People in that kind of situation would have a situation instead in which they were confronting a seller's market for labor, and that would make a huge difference. Another thing that's worth emphasizing is that absent the state, social norms could clearly ensure predictable, consistent support of community-wide aid programs without taxation. I just don't think that, especially in small, close-knit communities, there's any reason to doubt that if people had to count on each other rather than on the state, they wouldn't start to do so. The great anarchist theorist Michael Taylor, who's written books including The Possibility of Cooperation, which is a revision of his book Anarchy and Cooperation, and Liberty, Anarchy, and Community. Michael Taylor's pointed out that the state makes it likely, the operation of the state makes it likely that people will behave in ways that are quite different from those they would behave without its operation. That is to say, if the state takes over the provision of social services, for instance, there's no real surprise if people don't get involved in providing those services themselves.